All right, I think we can move this along now, can't we? Ren, do you want to close the door? Good afternoon and welcome to 50 Hertz, powered by Airborne Black. This weekend is all about techno and how you can pick up tips, tricks, learn the workflows, and generally become a better producer. Not necessarily a better person, but a better producer. It is my pleasure. He's going to be with us all week to introduce one of the big guns for the weekend from my neck of the woods in the UK. One half of Spektre. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one and only Paul Maddox.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you all for coming today. As you may know, my name is Paul Maddox. I'm part of a production duo called Spektre. We also run a label called Respekt Recordings. And I also spend quite a bit of my time doing production work for other people and doing tutorial videos as well. So I'm sort of quite into the teaching side too. The aim of the next half hour, 45 minutes, is I'm going to sort of show you a few ways of adding texture to tracks. Because a problem that you can often find yourselves with is tracks that feel a bit one-dimensional, you know, like they don't feel like they've got much depth to them. So the main way of doing that in music is by contrast. So that could be contrasting a clean sound against a dirty sound, or a bright sound against a dull sound, or anything like that. So I'm going to talk you through a few examples of how I would go about doing that using some of our Spektre tracks as the examples. So the first one I'm going to show you is a track that we did called Holding You, which was on Orange Recordings from Steve Mulder. And I'll give you a quick little blast of the track first. So the two main elements that contrast in style in this are the vocal, which is this part here, which is a sort of soulful, housey sampled vocal. Which was just from an a cappella, chopped it up in on a drum rack in live. So you can see this is the drum rack here, just had a few different slices of it that I just manually chopped out of the a cappella. So we've got, get the right channel on, and we've got, didn't use that one. That's the main one, that's the hook. And that's a little drop. So as you can hear, that's kind of a really soulful, housey kind of vocal, not kind of exactly what you would expect in a techno track. Probably be more suited to a housey thing. But by getting a bit of contrast, we made the synth line through the track as sort of computery and mechanical and techno as we could. So if we listen to the synth line, which is here. So by contrasting those two different things, it gives it a totally different feel. The vocal would have naturally lent itself to some like live bass or something like that, whereas putting a really mechanical electronic synth line behind it pushes things in a different direction. That was done with Yuhi Batzilla, the synth, kind of a digital FM kind of thing. And just to add even more of that machine kind of vibe to it, we added an arpeggiator that turns on and off, but not synced. So if you listen to these little bits in it where it kind of goes out of time. You can hear those little bits there were done by having a non-synchronized arpeggiator on that just kind of turns on for those one notes and gives it that sort of weird, sort of accelerating kind of thing. We used similar principles in the rest of the track to get contrast as well. So that's the most obvious one when looking at the whole track in overview. But we did the same in the drums as well. So if we listen to the main drum parts here, we've got a kick, just a kick, a hat, a ride. So if we listen to those in isolation first. That's all very straight, there's no groove to it at all. It's literally just a big kick, offbeat hat, onbeat and offbeat ride, like completely mechanical. So then to add a bit of counterpoint to that, we put a little snare drum in, but picked it from a completely different source as well. So all the other sounds are drum machine sounds, like a big Process 909 kick, 909 hats, some sort of electronic ride. So by putting something from a completely different source in, you can, again, add that contrast and texture to it. So what we used was one of the classic breakbeat samples, the old Lynn Collins one, which is here. As known from half of the old hip-hop tracks, and lots of drum and bass, like, been used a million times before. But just cropped it down, put a little low-pass filter on it so that it's just a little... And then added that into the drum groove. So, contrasts both in terms of rhythm, because it's a little bit looser than the rest of the stuff, but also in terms of sound. So the sort of organic sampled sound contrasting with the real machine 909 stuff. So while we're on the drums, I'm going to talk about layering a little bit. So layering is something that a lot of people feel like you have to do automatically, kind of by default. And that's not always the case. Like, I do quite a lot of production work for other people, as I was saying, and a lot of time people will send me Ableton projects that they want me to, tidy up or make sound a little bit better. And they'll have, like, 10 kick drums layered on top of each other and 15 hi-hats and stuff like this. And because somebody's told them, you'll get a bigger sound by layering. And that can be true, but just throwing more and more layers at things almost always makes things just muddy rather than adding any more power. So the first rule for me when it comes to layering is that you should always do it for a reason. So on this one, we've got, if you listen to the kick here, we've got the main kick, which probably was a few layers originally anyway, because it was one from my library, but it's quite a heavy kick. But then on top of that, we've just layered this little transient sound, because once I actually got the mix finished, we found that the kick had plenty of weight, plenty of presence, but what it was lacking was a bit of top end. Like, because there was quite a busy pattern going on with the hats and the rides, the kick just needed a little bit more sort of attack on it to make it punch through. So we just layered in this very subtle little transient thing here, which I think it's actually from a live drum kit. It's a bit of noise from a kick beater or something like that. And on its own, it doesn't sound like anything at all. But whether you can hear it well in here or not, I'm not sure, but it just adds that extra little bit of sort of hiss and fizz at the start of the kick. Whether you can pick that out or not, I'm not sure, but it does. It definitely, in the mix, it helps it all sit better. Where else? So yeah, the same principle can be applied to most percussion sounds, really. Hi-hats, claps, anything like that. With claps, often layering a snare quietly underneath a clap can help give it a nicer attack. Another thing that I quite frequently do with hi-hats is layering some sort of Foley sound on top of them. So if you've got like a clean shaker or a clean closed hat or something like that, it can be nice to add just like a little bit of hiss or a little bit of fuzz from a different source over the top. There isn't actually one on this track as an example, but and it can be quite a fun way to go out and find some sounds as well. Like I've just got a little portable recorder thing, a little Zoom recorder, and just go around recording weird stuff. Like there was some leaves in my garden the other week, and just sort of was kicking these leaves around, recording all the sort of hiss and crackle. And they're really useful little sounds. You just layer something subtle like that over the top of a hi-hat, and it just gives it loads more texture and more interesting feeling. What else we got? Back to layering. So another layer on this one was, I was just talking then about layering individual sounds, so putting two kicks on top of each other or a clap and a snare or something like that. But you can also do layering in a more holistic sense on the whole track. So in this one here, we've got this kind of background loop that kind of just mimics the groove of the track with something completely different. So if we just put that on its own. Where are we? This one. barely even hear that actually, but I'll just crank it up. So it's this kind of whispery vocal kind of sounding loop that emphasises the groove of the track. So it's kind of got something on the kick, something on the offbeat, something on the clap. Not made from any of the other bits. It was actually, this was kind of a bit of experimentation. So what it actually started with was it was a loop from the same vocal that the main vocal in the track was from. And we actually just kind of threw that in while we were trying to get the vocal to work and just liked the rhythm of it. So, but the sort of the vocal sound of it didn't really work. So just put a vocoder on top of that with white noise as the carrier, and you got this kind of like weird, whispery, breathy kind of thing. And just mixed really quietly. Like that's the key with these layering things. So if you listen to that in the mix, it's not super, super loud. But if you mute it in and out, you can tell it kind of, just because it's got quite a wide stereo image to it, and it's quite sort of white noisy, you can mix it really quiet, and it still adds a nice little layer of depth and detail to the track. I'll often do this as well with, that's quite a weird one, not exactly a typical one, but another good way to do this, you may hear a lot of tracks using things like tape hiss and vinyl noise in the background to add that kind of similar little bit of crackle and detail, which sounds cool, but I feel like the vinyl crackle thing's like a little bit played out. I've heard a few too many tracks with that in now, and it's kind of like a little bit, I don't know, a little bit of a cliche for me now. But another way to do the same thing is just get some ambient noise. So either just stick a mic in a room and just, record the sound of nothing in there and then turn it up so you get an interesting hiss. Or another interesting source for those is films and TV. So what I've done quite a lot of times is just recorded a chunk off a TV show or a film where not much is happening, and then just take the silence in between when the people are speaking. And although it's silence, it isn't always. There'll be a bit of ambience that's been added for the film, and then turn that up and just loop it in the background, and you'll get like an interesting little hiss and a little hum that can just, if a track's feeling a bit dead, it adds a bit of depth to it. So yeah, I'm going to switch to another project now. This was a track of ours called The Ark. I'll try to anyway. And the idea with this one, this was released on Pleasurecraft's label, Kraftek. And it's kind of got a melodic, trancey kind of top line over what's essentially like a fairly conventional techno track in the back. So this is kind of another way of creating texture by merging styles. Because if we listen, is this finally loaded now? Yeah, good. So if we listen to just the groove of this, mute the riffs out, you'll hear that it's like a fairly typical techno track, really, like a rumbly bass, made from kick drums and rides and hats, so fairly typical. So we've got kick drum, some sort of fast 16th note shakers, hats, offbeat shaker, ride, and some claps. So pretty much your standard techno stuff, like 909 samples, just rumbling bass, nothing particular out there. But then over the top of that, we've got what's kind of like a trance riff, really. Like Rich and I both grew up listening to trance before we got into techno, so we've always had like a soft spot for that kind of style. So sort of incorporating some of that into our Spektre stuff is something that we quite enjoy. So if we have a listen to the lead on its own, it's pretty much a trance thing, really. So, speed that up to 135 and put a synth bass behind it, and it's a trance tune, really. But by doing it at a different tempo and marrying it with completely different drums and bass than what you would expect, you get that nice contrast, the melodic top line, but then with the more heads down, serious techno groove behind it. This idea of texture is something that can be done on both a big scale and a small scale. It can be in terms of the whole track combining two different ideas, or it can be, layering two sounds up together. Still on this one, another example of how to do what I showed you with the vocoder thing and talking about with the ambient noise ideas. On this one, we resampled the whole groove of the track and ran it through a load of distortion and delay and stuff. So we basically just bounced out a groove which was the kick, the bass, and all the drums running. Just bounced out a loop of that for 8 bars or so. And then just went nuts, putting loads and loads of distortion, delay, all sorts of things on it, which gave us this in the end. So you can hear it's just like a real crunched up, distorted, delayed version of the groove. But then we used that in the same way that I showed you with the vocoder thing. So basically just mix it really quiet in the groove, and it just adds that extra layer. So if we have a listen to that with and without. You can hear that adding it on, it kind of just all sounds a bit bigger and a bit more together because it's got the same effects applied to the whole groove. It has as well as making it sound bigger and adding more harmonics and stuff. It also has the sort of secondary effect of tying it all together, which is a great texture can sort of work in both those ways. It can be both to add something or to bring the elements that you've already got together, like. A lot of old recordings, like really early 60s ones and stuff that had loads of tape hiss on them. Part of the reason why people used to, have that image of tape sounding better was partly because of the saturation and the warmth that it gave, but also the bit of hiss, just having that little bit of constant noise through the whole thing had a sort of magic effect of tying things together. So these are just techniques to, more interesting contemporary techniques to get that same kind of thing. So a few more of the little textural effects that we used on this one. We've got a little vocal that we used as a texture. So it was, again, this goes back to the same idea that I was saying on the previous track of taking things from unexpected sources. So it was the kind of soulful thing that we had on the last one. On this one, it was this little vocal here, which is... So this was the original sample. Throw your hands up in the air. It's a throw your hands up in the air. It's a not probably what you'd expect for either a techno thing or a trance thing, really. But in context, we turned it into this little bit. So just use that one little bit, and it adds a different texture in there, because everything else is quite synthy and quite electronic. So it just adds that little bit of human touch to it. Yeah, sorry. Again, so one thing I find with, another thing I get with projects that people send to me, you'll get people who've put a compressor on every single channel, on every single thing. And with any effect, not just compression, I would say it's important to only do it to achieve a goal. So if the sound sounds good, leave it alone. Don't put things on it to try and fix a problem that isn't there. Whereas compression can be very useful, don't get me wrong, but there's no need to apply it unless you need it. So typically on something like this, I would have a little bit of parallel compression on the drum bus. So I'd usually use like a UAD 1176 on that, but Ableton's glue compressor is really good as well. That'd be another good shout for that. But other than that, I'll only do it to fix a problem, so if you've got a synth maybe that you've got a big, like an acid line or something where the level's all over the place, get it in check with a compressor. But most of the time I tend to not use a lot because I find with electronic music particularly, you've got control at the source, so if your hi-hat, you want to change the attack of your hi-hat, I would just do that on the sampler rather than trying to do it with compression, So yeah, I'm a big fan of getting the sounds right at the start, rather than having to process them too much. But different people work different ways, but that's my take on it. No worries. So yeah, where were we? Yeah, so a few more textural layers. The vocal part there that I've just showed you was one. Then we added a little bit more background as well with these little vocal layers, which are here. So we took that vocal that I just showed you and time stretched it and resampled it. So we ended up with this here, which is just a big, long, whooshy time stretch kind of thing. Bit of a horror sound effect vibe going on with that. But then just repeated that on every beat. So just got this, and that just loops throughout the whole track. So if we zoom out to the arrangement, you can see it's this sort of orangey coloured track here. And it goes all the way from the start to the end with just automation on it, bringing it in and out. It's, again, really subtle. Pitched it down a bit from where it was originally. And that just runs pretty much all the way through the track. There's that version of it just filtering in and out. And then we also did a higher octave that comes in a little bit later on. That gives a bit more hype. And they, again, it just adds another little thing. The whole track doesn't need them. It'd work without them, but it just adds that bit of extra detail. And leads me on to something else, actually. So creating effects from sounds that are already in your track is a good way to make it all gel, because if you're just looking for some little incidental effects, some whooshes and sweeps and things like that, it can be tempting to just throw them in from a sample pack. And that will work. You know, you can get, there's a million good sample packs for that sort of thing out there. But I find when we get demos sent like that, they can sometimes feel a little bit thrown together. You know, it can feel like someone's got the track and then, you know, just thrown a load of samples at it to finish it off, which doesn't always make it sound that coherent. Whereas if you do things like this and make an effect out of something that's already in your track, it'll have a little bit of the same tone to it and a little bit of the same feel to it, which, makes things feel more together to me. Not that I'm entirely against sample pack stuff. You know, I do use some sometimes, but I'd always try and make it yourself first before going to a sample pack, rather than the other way around. And I think you'll find yourself doing more interesting processes that way. What else we got here? So yeah, another back to the contrast and texture idea. Another way of doing that is with different effects treatments. So I was talking before about adding layers to things. So I'm now thinking more about how different elements sit within the track, you know, giving things their own space. So the two main ways that you would go about doing that are with EQ, to obviously make sure that your high-end stuff stays in the high end and your low-end stuff stays in the low end and so on. But also with spatial effects, so reverb and delay. And as a rule, keeping things dry makes them feel like they're at the front of the mix, and things that have got reverb and delay on feel like they're at the back-ish. It's not always as concrete as that, but that's generally how it works. So a good way to create contrast, again, is to have different groups of things treated differently in terms of effects. So on this, the drums, if we listen to those, the drums and the bass, so I'll solo the drums and bass together. There's not much effect on anything. There's a little bit of room reverb on some of the hats, and that's about it. So if a bit of delay on the claps, actually, and that's about it. So if you listen to that, it's quite a dry groove. Aside from the effects, that's pretty dry. You know, there's a few small things, but nothing drastic. So what we want to do then is create contrast in terms of space between that part of the groove and the other parts. So the other parts we had in there are our trance riff, obviously, which I already played you, and this sort of FM stab sound. So with that in mind of creating depth, what we did was kept all the drums and bass really, really dry, and then the other two sounds, which are the FM stab and the trance thing, just piled absolutely loads of reverb and delay onto them. So you can hear on the FM stab here, if we play it without the spatial effects on there, it's quite a different sound. Sort of sounds quite plasticky and basic. But then, big reverb on it. And a bit of delay as well. And suddenly that's sitting in a different space to the drums. You know, the drums are kind of up front and in your face, and that's sort of big and fill in the middle. So we did a similar treatment on the trance riff. Not exactly the same, but pretty similar, which is here. So yeah, that was from Diva, and let's have a listen to it without effects. So turn the effects off. Some of them have got the effects link actually. So pretty basic without the effects. So delay and reverb on it, and then we actually added some more reverb on that turned on and off through the track. So you can hear those two are, bathed in a huge layer of reverb and delay, whereas the rest of the track's kept pretty dry. So that adds that, again, different way of adding depth. And you can do that if you're mixing things with vocals in as well. Probably less relevant to techno, but in a lot of more housey stuff that I engineer for other people. Often vocals, a mistake people make is they think putting more effects on the vocal makes it sound bigger, which if you listen to it in isolation, it does, but then it also pushes it back in the mix. So one thing that I always find is sort of drying things out to pull them forward is a useful trick if you've got a mix that's a bit muddy. Back to things having a space in the track. I mentioned the other way to do that is with EQ. So we'll go back to our trance riff here, and there's not a huge amount of EQ on there, but the main thing that you can see just here is that there's a fairly steep high pass on it. Now, if we listen to the track, to the sound on its own, you can hear it better in here than you can in my studio, actually. There's quite a lot of low-end rumble on those low notes. And it does sound better with that in, to be honest. It sounds bigger when you play it on its own. But if you play it in context of the track, you can't hear any difference at all. So because that bottom end's all masked by the other elements that we've got in there, the kick and the bass and all that sort of stuff, it's pointless having all that bottom end in there. It's just cluttering up the mix. So that's a really good tip, is to always EQ in context. So don't solo the sound that you're working on and then play with the EQ to make it sound good on its own, because there's no point. Making it sound good on its own isn't going to help. You need to make it sound good in the context of your track. So with something like this is quite a simple example, but if you're trying to find, the right point to do that cut, listen to it in the track and then move the cut up and down until it has a negative effect. So if we played the track and then swept that high pass up, you can hear that anywhere higher than round about there, it starts to sound thin, and it does have like a detrimental effect on the sound. But up to the point where we've got it at, it's just getting rid of stuff that's cluttering your mix up. So that's a good tip.
Could you show how you then made your bass line?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So it's quite a simple one on this. So let's go to the group. So the bass is just a couple of sounds down here. So it's just a couple of kick drums, basically. So if we listen to, this is the bass group. So it's just two sounds bouncing off each other. The kick does most of the work in the bottom end on this, to be honest. The bass is kind of just bouncing off it. But all they are is a little sample here, which is kind of the bump. So if we have a look at the MIDI for that, you can see that that's doing just before the beat on the first one, and then the offbeat on the second one. So that's sort of in context. And all that was it was either a kick or an offbeat. Just it was sampled off a record. I can't remember what it was, to be honest. But if we listen to it without the effects on, it's probably got a hi-hat and stuff on there as well. False time. Yeah, so it was a kick drum sampled off a tune. And then the rumble was probably a similar thing. Yeah, again, that would have been sampled off a record. So don't be afraid to do that. I think people can get a little bit scared of it and feel like they're cheating if you sampling stuff from other people's tunes. And like, don't get me wrong, if you're nicking all their drums or nicking their riff or something like that, then you are. But if you're just taking little, tiny little snippets from places, you just think of it as source material. If you're, there's no way that I can't even remember where it was from, but there's absolutely no way that you would associate that with whatever tune it was from. So I think, I've kind of always had that approach of using samples as source material as anything's fair game really. But in terms of processing, it's just really filtered down. And yeah, that's it. I think I don't think there was anything else on there. What's on the group? Yeah, no, that's it. Just monoed. So I just used utility to make sure that it was all in mono because they were sampled off record. So there was a little bit of stereo information in there that we wanted to get rid of. That sort of brings me on to something actually related to the EQing thing, and it's something that I've only learned myself quite recently. Really, I used to probably do this in a less good way. But it's to be bold with EQing, like if you've got a bass that's a sub bass, like just filter it right down, do a low pass at 120 hertz or something, and if you're not missing the mid-range information that was in there, you don't need it. Same with hi-hats and things, be brutal with the high pass, take it all the way up. And a lot of the time you'll get a cleaner mix as a result. So yeah, I think that's kind of all the main topics that I wanted to fit in. I've probably gone through those reasonably quickly. So is there any bits that I didn't go into enough depth on that anybody would like to ask about?
Don't be shy. Yeah, 1 second. Let me get that mic up there, Paul. 1 second.
Hi, do you use any kind of frequency sidechaining for your bass processing?
Generally not, no. Sometimes I would use just a standard sidechain from the kick if there was a bass that wasn't quite sitting right. But similar to the compression thing, I generally try and fix that sort of stuff at the sample. So what I'll often do actually is if I had an audio, so a bass that was an audio loop, for example, rather than using the sidechain, I'll quite often use clip envelopes. So if we imagine for a second that this was an audio clip, I would use the clip envelopes, to do something like that, as opposed to actually using the sidechain, because you can get more fine control over the curve that way. So that's quite a good little technique that I sometimes use, because with a sidechain you've obviously got a certain degree of control, but with clip envelopes you can do it, you've minute control. So yeah, that's a good way to do that. Anyone else?
Any more? Don't be afraid. Yep.
Yeah.
Where do you find all your vocal samples?
So vocal samples, lots of digging basically. I've been doing this for quite a long time now, so I've picked up quite a lot from they used to do a series of records called Acapellas Anonymous that were these sort of white label bootleg records with 10 or 12 acapellas on each side. But all sorts of places though, so, some from acapellas, some from other places as well, some from actually just sampling from records. I've kind of always been of the, whether this is great advice or not, I don't know, but I've kind of always been of the mindset when you're sampling stuff to just do it and worry about it later, tell the label, if the track gets signed, tell them where the sample's from and, let them deal with it. It's always been my approach.
Has that been an issue with you before? Copyrights and stuff?
Touch wood, we've been fairly lucky. I mean, I think, don't sue me if this backfires on anyone. But I think generally when you're making sort of fairly niche music, in a relatively small scene like techno is, unless you do something absolutely blatant, generally in my experience, people aren't going to cause too much of a fuss about it. But I mean, always tell the label though. That's the most important thing. because what you don't want is them to get in trouble and it be your fault. So.
Do you know a program how you can make your own techno kick, except for Nicky Romero's kick?
With kicks, usually what we'll do, I've covered this in a few of my online tutorials actually, is again about layering. So usually what we'll do is, we'll sometimes sample them from records, sometimes from sample packs, sometimes from hardware, like I've got an electro-analog rhythm that's good for those sort of analog bottom layers. But it's all about fitting the layers together, you know. So like I showed on Holding You, the first project here, it's a case of using different layers to fill in the gaps, you know. So you start with something that you like, whether that be a sample or a drum machine or whatever. Put it in the context of your track, and then work out what's missing, you know. So does it need more weight, or does it need more punch, or more aggression, or whatever, and then look for other layers to fill the gaps, basically.
Thank you.
When you, question for you, Paul.
Yeah, sure.
When you do a project, do you give yourself like airtime to come out of the studio?
100%. Like I've said many times, sometimes the most productive 10 minutes you can do in a day is going and having a cup of tea and having a rest, because for two reasons really. Like firstly, you get used to the things that are wrong. You know, if you've been listening to a track for 3 hours or 4 hours or something, even if there's something glaringly obvious that's wrong with it, you'll have got used to it, and you sort of train out the problems. Whereas just going away for 15, 20 minutes, doing something completely different, you know, stick the TV on, like, you know, watch a soap, you know, have a cup of tea, whatever, just disconnect from music for those few minutes. Then usually when you go back, straight away you'll go, you know, that's not right. And it's, you can sometimes spend hours and hours trying to fix a problem that you could have just fixed by having a break. So yeah, one of the most important parts of the production process, definitely. Yeah.
What's your tip to make your technical tracks not boring? Like equipment and drop off like 3 minutes. How do you make it not boring? Still interesting.
A couple of ways. One is sort of automating elements. You know, like I was showing with those the time stretch thing on here. And just having that, you know, subtle ebb and flow of a filter moving up or down or something can add movement. But another way as well, particularly with techno actually, is making sure that your arrangement is dynamic. So rather than just constantly adding things, so, you know, it's very easy to think, right, so I'll have a hi-hat comes in at bar 16, something else comes in at bar 33. Dropping things in and out can make as much difference. So, you know, say you've had an element that's been in from the start of your track. So let's say you had a fast shaker that's been in from the beginning. Just drop that out and swap it for something else, you know, and just doing little ins and outs like that can be cool.
Yeah, and do we have a tip or do you recommend to use same samples, like in intro you use the hi-hat and in the drum you use the hi-hat? Do you recommend that? Or?
So what, using different ones for different sections of the track? You can or you can't. I mean, generally with the Spektre stuff, we don't do too much of that. You know, we'll tend to pick one sound and process it. So say we had a hi-hat, we'll filter it a little bit for the intro and then turn the filter off when it kicks in. But there's nothing wrong with doing it with different samples. That's just, that's totally fine, yeah.
Will you also test out pre-master, or will you wait for the master before testing it?
One thing, I'll usually do a rough master myself. So I won't do much, but, you know, I'll just stick a limiter on it and stick a little bit of basic EQ on, just to make sure you've got a nice loud version to play out. Because if you test a pre-master against fully mastered tracks, it'll always sound disappointing. You know, it'll always sound a bit flat and a bit lumpy. But if you just do a rough master, you know, just get it nice and loud, put it through, you know, even just stick it through T-Rax or Ozone or whatever, just so that it's comparable in level to the stuff that you're playing it with. That'll give you a much better feel as whether or not there's anything massively wrong with the track. You know, a good mastering engineer will always do a better job than a preset thing. But those ready-made tools can actually be quite useful for just getting a working version to play out.
Any more questions? Are you sure? He is back tomorrow, so if you want to ask more questions tomorrow. Okay, please make some noise for Paul Maddox.
Thank you very much.